Today, I want to talk about something deeper than policy, deeper than bureaucracy, and deeper than any signal agency. I want to talk about the rule of law, the backbone of this nation, the foundation of our democracy, and the one principle that separates a free society from a system where power answers only to itself. The rule of law is simple in concept. As someone who spent a career in law enforcement and years teaching criminal justice, I've always believed that if the law applies to citizens, it must apply to institutions too. No one is above the law, and everyone is protected by it. But the rule of law is not self-sustaining. It survives only when institutions behave as if it matters. And right now, we are seeing patterns inside federal agencies that raise real concerns about whether that commitment is holding. Not because of ideology, not because of elections, but because of behavior. The rule of law is not a slogan. It's not a talking point. It's not a political weapon. It is a system of accountability, and it's built on transparency, record preservation, equal treatment, judicial oversight, truthfulness in government action, respect for legal obligations. When agencies ignore these principles, the rule of law doesn't collapse overnight. It erodes slowly, quietly, and often unnoticed. And that erosion is exactly what we're seeing in the federal handling of herbicide exposure on Okinawa. Let's talk about what the evidence shows. A federal preservation order was issued in 1979. Judge Jack Weinstein required agencies to preserve and report anything related to Agent Orange exposure. Agencies did not comply. Records were destroyed. Notifications were never sent. Events like the Ben Hoy spill were never reported to the court. FOI responses today still show avoidance. Agencies pass responsibility in circles. Records cannot be located. Searchers are not reasonably likely to produce results. Training materials rely on outdated science. And veterans are denied because the government lost or destroyed the very records needed to prove exposure. This is not a partisan issue. It's not an institutional issue. It is a direct threat to the rule of law. When a federal agency ignores a court order, this is not a clerical error. It's a breach of the judicial system. And when records required by law are destroyed, that is not an accident. It's a violation of public trust. When agencies deny claims because of missing evidence they themselves failed to preserve, that is not neutral decision. It is a structural injustice. And when the behavior becomes normalized, when it becomes routine, the rule of law weakens. Not because of political wins, not because of who holds office, but because institutions have drifted, because institutions stop feeling bound by the rules that are supposed to restrain them. That is the danger. The herbicide exposure issue on Okinawa is not a veterans issue. It's a rule of law issue. Here's why. Veterans were exposed. Records existed. A judge ordered those records preserved. Agencies destroyed them anyway. Veterans were then denied because the records were gone. That is the exact scenario the rule of law is supposed to prevent, and it happened anyway. This is not just a failure of policy, it's a failure of legal duty. The rule of law is not defended by slogans. It is defended by citizens demanding transparency, courts enforcing accountability, agencies honoring their obligation, historians preserving the truth, veterans refusing to be erased, and people like you and me insisting that the record be set straight. The rule of law survives when ordinary people refuse to let institutions drift into convenience, secrecy, and self-protection. That's why this work matters. That's why these FOIA requests matter. And that's why the Okinawa evidence matters, because the rule of law is only as strong as our willingness to defend it. There's something else we need to talk about, something that sits right beneath every denial, every missing record, every outdated training packet, and every claim that exposure was unlikely. It's the false narrative, the narrative that says there was no herbicide on Okinawa. The narrative didn't appear overnight. It was built, it was reinforced, and it was protected. There were no shipments, there were no spills, there were no storage sites, there were no exposures. A narrative that has been repeated so many times over the years that it became institutional muscle memory. And here's the truth. When a false narrative becomes institutional doctrine, it doesn't just distort history, it distorts justice. And that distortion has consequences. Consequences for veterans, men who served honorably and were told their cancers were coincidence, their illnesses were unrelated, their suffering was not consistent with exposure, not because the evidence wasn't there, but because the narrative said it couldn't be. Consequences for dependents, families who lived on contaminated basis were told their children's illnesses were unexplained, their miscarriages were unrelated, their losses were not service connected, not because the science supported that conclusion, but because the narrative demanded it. Consequences for the rule of law, when agencies cling to a narrative instead of evidence, when they train healthcare workers to deny instead of investigate, when they destroy records that contradict the official story. They are not just failing veterans, they're weakening the very foundation of the rule of law, because the rule of law cannot survive in a system where truth is optional, records are disposable, court orders are ignored, and institutional convenience outranks legal duty. That is the danger, and that is where we are. As we close today's session, I want to leave you with this. The evidence is not hidden. It's not theatrical. It's not speculative. It's right in front of us. The evidence is in the actions of the agencies that ignored a federal preservation order. The evidence is in the unfair practices that denied Vietnam and Okinawa veterans the recognition they earned. The evidence is in the VA training materials that taught healthcare workers to dismiss exposure claims before they even began. The evidence is in the missing records that were supposed to be preserved. The evidence is in the denials built on uncertainty the government itself created. This isn't just a veterans issue, it's a historical issue. This is a rule of law issue, and the rule of law survives only when people insist that truth matters, records matter, and justice matters, even when institutions find it inconvenient. We're not done. We're just getting started. If this episode gave you something to think about, share it with someone who needs it, a veteran, a dependent, or anyone who cares about truth and accountability. And follow this channel so you don't miss the next session, where we'll continue exposing how institutional behavior, not politics, is shaping the future of the rule of law in this country. Next time, we're going to look at something most people have never seen, the paper trail that shows how a narrative becomes policy. So be sure to tune in for that.